Lama da boo, lama da boo, lama da boo da boo. Lama da boo, lama da boo, lama da boo da boo.
All right, welcome back to our book study on After Buddhism, subtitled Rethinking the Dharma for a Secular Age. And we're on chapter 1. We're picking up where we left off on the last session, which is part 4. And I was thinking about our conversation last time, like you and I had not talked about this book at all before we started recording. And I kind of like that. I think that's a good model for us to just do the reading and then have real fresh conversation live. And it was interesting for me, your take on his approach and like his idea of like I guess like a lot of what he says is like it's being taught a certain way, but it should be this instead. And you had the sense that like it already was that, and there maybe wasn't like it wasn't at least as pervasive as he makes it sound, that like all, you know, the interpretations of emptiness and such have gone off the rails. But I thought a little bit about that yesterday and was thinking about how just this podcast in general, for me at least, may be like a long extended examination of all the mistakes I've made in the practice. And
yeah,
we said before, we're not enlightened, so I can definitely say that if there's anything I have to share, it's the mistakes I've made, and maybe highlight the times where I recognize like, oh, I didn't make a mistake there, and why that's a good thing. But that was my kind of takeaway from a little bit of what we talked about yesterday.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I feel like just from the little that I've read so far on it, it's like maybe the main kind of value that will come out of the discussions is kind of how this book is an expression of his process, like that, you know, like that's kind of how I see it in the positive sense. He's kind of just communicating how he came to recognize some understandable view of all of it, you know?
Yeah. And maybe part of why that's part of like bringing this into the secular age, maybe if we read things about great practitioners of the past, you know, I think one of the few kinds of books that we were supposed to have in retreat, not supposed to have, but if we were going to have a book, it was recommended that it be like hagiographies, Namtar in Tibetan, you know, like stories of the great masters. And I can tell you that very little of what I saw in those books reflected anything that I know in my life.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's an interesting point for sure.
So we got to do something to fill that space.
Yeah, that's after I read this chapter, like I talked to my mom a little bit about it, like just what I was thinking about it. And I was sort of telling her that really like it largely struck me as this gentleman given his own personal account of his, you know, process of practice and all that. And like my maybe kind of too harsh critique in that moment was kind of like, if you want to write a book about your journey, that's cool, like that's probably valuable, but I don't know why it's presented like this, you know, rethinking of the whole thing. But anyway, like without being critical of it, I think that is what you're saying is the positive version of it. Like maybe more people should be telling their story of grappling with all this stuff, you know. But yeah.
Well, and it could be too that he, I'm learning a little bit more about his story because I just recently read his Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist book, which is, I think, 10 years before this book. And I also started his first work, Alone with Others. And I should go back and finish it, but I had trouble getting through Alone with Others because I had just read After Buddhism. And that was he's kind of had the same life work this whole time, but you know, After Buddhism is the culmination of all of this practice and stuff like that, and all of the attempts at explaining a secular Buddhism, and Alone with Others felt to me just like a early, half worked out system where I feel like now he's gotten much more specific. But I said all of that to say I don't really know what his environment is, but I'm getting a little bit better idea about like where he lives and moves through the world, and I think that there may be a lot more extended periods that he had immersed in these institutions, these Buddhist institutions, in the places, in other places, in non-Western contexts, and I would say that so that kind of take on like what Buddhism is or is not, or how it's departed from the actual embodied meaning, like that may also have a lot to do with just like the same reason why, in my experience, culturally, Buddhist individuals, people who come from Buddhist countries, are a lot less likely to have a practice of meditation. They're a lot less likely to be connecting the practice to daily life. And so that may be another kind of dimension of this, is like if he's in Tibet or something, or Japan or something, like there may be a lot of just ritual and going through the motions and collecting stories and facts about Buddhism, and that may be his perspective of compared to ours, where in America it is pretty. I mean, we've taken it to the other extreme where it's like therapy and corporate wellness, and so we actually are pretty well connected, maybe more than the places where this all came from.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, it's interesting to explore this stuff because it's like there's this is that's another thing I was kind of thinking about. I mean, this is a conversation about in one way about like wellness and religion, like where those overlap, where they don't, how those two things look different, where they're in opposition and where they benefit each other. Religion is religion. I mean, there's a lot of similar things that go wrong, whatever the religion is. And yeah. But yeah, so but yeah, it's been interesting. I like that we are having different experiences of it. That's important. I think that's great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we were at part 4, and this is where he starts to talk about the Son tradition. Were you familiar with this at all? I'd never heard of that before. And he expresses that their like main practice is to ask the question, what is this? That's kind of the meditation, is to just stick with this question, repeated question of what is this, and really ask that again and again. And he talks a lot about doubt in this chapter, the importance of doubt. He mentions the saying like great doubt, great awakening, little doubt, little awakening, no doubt, no awakening, which made me immediately kind of think of particularly on the Vajrayana side, where we say devotion is the key, and devotion and trust. And I know that's a thing that I've gone to an extreme with, like, and not maintained a middle way. And I know other people have too, but I think that's one of those things where I don't think you can say across the board that no doubt, no awakening, but I also don't think you can say that you the opposite,
Yeah. That story, I mean, of the whole like what is this thing, kind of I remember hearing, I don't remember who told this story. It could be just like a story that's retold by several people, but it was about some like debate stage between possibly like a Zen master of this tradition, now that I know that that's their kind of their thing, but like a debate that was staged between a Zen master and the previous Kalu Rinpoche. And like the way I remember it is just that like the Zen master like held up an orange, and his approach was to just ask Kalu Rinpoche, what is this? And it was like it was like his I guess the deeper symbolic speak was that like that was his way of bringing up like the point of emptiness, you know, like
Mm,
like we call this, people may call this orange or whatever, but like you can't really say what this is, you know. Uh, and then, but so he just is like, "What is this?" Right? And Kaler Rinpoche famously responded by like turning to his translator and saying, "What's wrong with this guy? Don't they have oranges in his country?" And, like that was supposed to be like his way of saying that it's just like simple appearance, like
yeah.
it's just an orange. Like there's no like it's empty, but it's still just an orange.
Hmm.
Which is kind of like where he comes to at the end of this section. I feel like that was a similar thread of like logic or something to his explanation of maybe like the real way to take non-duality. Like it's not just, it doesn't negate that there is dualistic appearance. It's more like, non-duality maybe is more like not being in conflict with the appearance of duality rather
Mm,
than that there's no perception of it at all. It's just kind of recognizing that it's like not the absolute truth. It's just an appearance. Like things, we have the appearance of a self, but it's still empty of
yeah.
true existence, you know?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good anecdote. Yeah. Um, the analogy that stuck out to me from this chapter was about the red hot ball when he says like the way you're, because he was talking about like asking questions viscerally, like really like with your whole body, asking questions and inquiring in a way that's not just
Oh,
mental but that
yeah.
like involves all of your senses. And he uses this analogy of like you're supposed to ask the questions as if like almost like you had swallowed a red hot iron ball and were trying to vomit it
Yeah.
up but couldn't. So like, and
Wow.
that like I can imagine that, like I mean, and I follow Instagram. Do you follow the Red Hot Copper Ball Instagram page? I can't remember if it's called.
Mm-mm.
It's either Red Hot Copper Ball or Red Hot Iron Ball or something. But it's just an Instagram page of this red. They heat this metal ball up and then they put it on stuff and watch what happens. So that analogy really stuck out to me because I've seen
Wow.
red hot metal balls melt through all kinds of different things now, and just imagining what that would
Yeah.
do to my insides, and I would be trying to
Wow.
get it up, but what's trying to push it up is also being eaten away. And like I love that analogy though, because it's like there's two forces at work.
Wow.
There's like one that you can't impact, which is that heat and what that ball is going to do to the body. And then there's your,
Mm.
effort. And the idea that those two things have to go together. Like there has to be the uncontrolled aspect and then the aspect of motion, like effortful motion on our own part. Like that
Mm.
also, those two things have to be there, even if it seems maybe like they're working in opposition, or that there isn't like an ultimate place to get. And that actually reminds me too of early on, we didn't talk about this yesterday, but in the beginning, they talk about the 8 questions that the Buddha refused to answer. They're usually broken down as like 8 or 10. But those questions are, I don't think we've ever covered this on the podcast before either, but there's a group of questions that the Buddha just refused to answer. And they were things like, is the world eternal? Is the world not eternal? Is the world finite? Is the world not finite? Are body and soul identical? Or are body and soul different? And the last of them all kind of relate to death. So there's one about like, does the Tathagata exist after death? Or does the Tathagata not exist after death? Does the Tathagata both exist and not exist? Does the Tathagata neither exist nor not exist? And Tathagata, meaning like, is another word kind of for the Buddha, or is that what you would say? I feel like I don't have a
Yeah.
clear
Yeah.
definition of that
I
word.
think
But
that's yeah. Let me yeah. I mean, it definitely is like another word for the Buddha. I was trying to think if it. Yeah, I think it is because, like, there's the Tathagata Garba, like that usually gets translated as Buddha essence.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
It's an honorific. I also just looked it up. It's an honorific title of the Buddha. But all of that to say, like, I thought what was interesting about that, and to relate it to the iron ball thing, is what resonated for me in terms of like daily life is just this idea of looking forward to or fearing endings and beginnings, and like this fixation. So first of all, those questions he didn't answer, not because he didn't have an answer or he didn't know. We don't know that, but we know that he didn't answer those questions because they were irrelevant to the path. They were irrelevant to the path of ending suffering. So that's like the analogy of the arrow, I think, that comes up. The idea of like somebody's shot with an arrow, and before you take the arrow out, they want to know who shot it and who made the arrow and what kind of wood is it, when in fact what needs to happen is the arrow needs to get removed so that the suffering can end. And similarly, getting hung up on is the world eternal or not eternal is irrelevant to ending suffering in this moment. And so, I was thinking about how I started running again and working up to doing running for the whole 5K time rather than doing like intervals. So I've been doing like a little bit of running and a little bit of walking and making the running time longer and longer. And I have an interval timer that I set, so that beeps at me when it's time to run or walk. And I did that. I remember I got that years ago because I realized that looking at the time was causing me to suffer in the moment. But now I've been doing my running at the gym, and there is a timer on the treadmill in front of me. And I had, like, without even really noticing, I had turned most of my mental effort during the run into doing math about the time on the timer, like how much longer. If I started at 15 seconds after 2 minutes, then how long until 1 minute and 45 seconds from now when I start to get to walk again, And so in that way, I had the whole time I'm like either looking forward to when I can stop running or worrying about when I'll have to start running again, when the whole reason I'm there is to run. Like, that's the whole point of why I'm doing this, is to get healthier and I actually kind of enjoy running, even though it's difficult. And it just, like, I realized that, and I had a towel with me, and I just laid a towel over the thing. And and I'm running, and I'm like, and so it was like the first time was really like a profound moment for me, because I was running and I was like, all right, well, what do I do now? I can't think about the time. I have to just kind of be here, just run and see what running feels like. And I'm running, and I'm like, all right, I feel okay. It must be about half done. And then beep, beep. And like I had before that, I had always been like so tired by the end of the interval. Like, I don't know that I can even keep going. But when I couldn't see the time, all of a sudden I was able to double the time of my interval. I was doing like 1 minute and 30 seconds, and I was able to take it up to 3 minutes all of a sudden. And without looking at the clock, I was able to do that with much less effort for a longer period of time. And that really has struck me as like a daily practice now, like really noticing how much am I waiting for this to end, whatever this is, and how much am I like glad that I'm here now, but worrying when this is going to end. And just seeing how that causes suffering, that sort of clinging even just to this idea of like one thing and then another.
Right. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's like, yeah, probably everything practically fall into that,
Yeah. So that would be definitely a potential practice tip for today, is keep eyes open for when you're waiting for stuff to end. And honestly, that reflects all the research that one of the most famous papers on the benefits of meditation was called "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." And that was maybe 20 years ago or something. They figured out that like people who were doing a thing, I think the way they did the test was people would get text messages, and they would be asked like, what are you doing? What are you thinking about? How do you feel? And they found that people are more likely to feel better. I'm not using scientific words, but they're going to be happier when they are present with whatever they're doing. And it's irrelevant if what they're doing is considered pleasant or not. If it's an unpleasant thing and they have to do it and they're present with it, they're going to be happier than if their mind is wandering to some other place where they are not connected with what they're doing. So it really is, even if it's not your favorite thing, you can be happier just by being there and doing it rather than thinking about something else, letting your mind go somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I don't think so. Honestly, on that section, I guess we could go ahead and go to 5.
I want to share one more quote, which is that he says, it's not about rejecting dualities in favor of a hypothetical non-duality, but to learn to live with them more fluidly and ironically. And even more to the point, he says, the danger of duality against which the Buddha warns his followers does not lie in oppositional thinking itself. Rather, it lies in how we use such thinking to reinforce and justify our egoisms, cravings, fears, and hatreds. So I love the idea of thinking of duality as like a tool that we use for something else, which is reinforcing really like self-identity, like using that as a way to reinforce attachment to the self, as opposed to at least counterbalancing that towards using oppositional thinking as a means for happiness and reducing clinging.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that kind of fits, just with the idea, obviously, of like skillfully using the illusion of duality. I mean, a lot of the practice we did in retreat, right? Like Vajrayana type practices kind of based on that logic. Using the appearance or the sort of illusory concept of a self differently than we normally do, like sort of reinforming the impulses to have self-perception in like a more positive or in a way that's imbued with wisdom. I guess you could really just say it simply like to kind of inhabit the perception of a self, like knowing its illusory nature, probably kind of all comes down to that.
Yeah. Music. I mean, all we have to work with is our experience. So we gotta, I think that's why the rituals of visualization and meditational deities, it's one technology of working with our experience. And I think if that technology came to be, there are countless other technologies. And I think that the reason I mentioned that is because, number one, it's not like the progression of spiritual technology stopped in 500 years ago in Tibet. Like it's still moving forward. Science is advancing it. There are all kinds of techniques that can have the same effect, and we may even stumble on them ourselves without somebody telling us. And that can be valid too.
Yeah, I mean, and I think just like as a kind of the general point of that at the end of that little section is really important in terms of like us bringing out the kind of subtle insight that this book can have. Like he's that's a really valuable point that is maybe a little bit misunderstood by all of us at some point, like in reckoning with Buddhist philosophy. Like it's easy to sort of see the idea of non-duality as like he's saying, just kind of like a vague theoretical oneness of everything. Like there's no texture of experience. There's no, like, the fact that there's no truly existent self means that like the ego and the self is like almost kind of an enemy, and like it's just like not real at all, when actually it's more that the point is that it's sort of like the fact that it's not truly existent uh, doesn't mean that it doesn't appear, you know. I mean, that's a subtle point, but that's crucial really for Buddhist philosophy in general. I mean, that's the whole thing with appearance and emptiness too. Like, I mean, if we don't recognize that it's not saying, if we don't draw the distinction between existence and appearance, all is lost, I would say. I mean, you know, it's like to say the self doesn't exist does not mean that it doesn't appear, right? And
Yeah.
that goes for everything. Like to say that, you know, like appearance is not truly existent, our perceptions are not truly existent. It doesn't mean that they don't appear and that we don't still experience life. And I mean, while that might not be like, while that is, I guess, the intent and the true meaning of the teaching all along, uh, I do think it's crucial that voices like this, this fellow here, and like we've talked about Trungpa before, like to have those points clarified is pretty crucial, because that's, you know, it's subtle, and that's something that could easily get lost in translation, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean that makes me think too of how often I myself, or I've heard people say that like what appears is some sort of or they take whatever appears as some sort of indication that their practice is defective or deficient.
Right,
You know,
right.
like I
Yeah.
felt anger today. You know, all this
Right,
meditation, and
right.
today I got angry. You know, like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um, and it's those very normal appearances, those very mundane appearances that are inseparable from this ultimate truth that we talk about. So if you're going to distance
Mm,
yourself from your very human experiences, you're equally distancing yourself from ultimate truth. You can't
mm.
have one or the other. You can't start to cut out the appearance of a self without also cutting out your insight into ultimate truth. I think that's an accurate statement, you know,
Yeah, yeah,
because they're
yeah.
not separate.
That's
They're the same thing, you know?
yeah, absolutely. That's a great, great point.
Yeah. Well, what'd you get out
Yeah.
of, you good to move to part 5?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I know you said you got a lot more notes for these sections. Me too.
Yeah, especially like 6 and 7, I think. But let's see. So with 5,
This is
so
really
I
kind of the
mean, he
equality section, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly. That's what uh I mean, he makes some good points that like, you know, we definitely saw uh many examples of in our kind of institutions. I didn't find them to be particularly revelatory, although they're definitely like, I mean, you know, just like the inclusion of women in the ordained sangha, like that's still something that uh, is kind of in the works of like making it more widespread. But and then like the honoring of the monastic sangha in such a more pronounced way than lay sangha. You know, those are things that like I understand um, the issues involved with that, but at the same time, I kind of feel like those are just the age old pitfalls of institutional religion.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I would argue for sure that we should still try to um, maybe kind of dissolve those as we go, but at the same time I don't really know if those things are ever going to totally go away. Like I feel like it'll kind of always be something, but at the same time the essence of the teaching I feel like has remained intact, which is actually the incredible thing about Buddhism to me.
Yeah.
is that despite all of that kind of nonsense that has gone on, there have been voices all along that have pointed at it as being nonsense and
Mm-hmm.
maintained, like this is what the teachings of the Buddha are actually about. And I feel like again, it's maybe about um, just kind of trying to find the voices that really like speak the truth. Uh, but these are good points at the same time. I mean, obviously, like women should be able to become nuns if they want to and be treated with respect. And really, all humans should be treated with respect. So,
Yeah.
I mean, just in general. Um, but one other thing that I wrote down here was let me just take a look. Uh I did kind of want to like he makes this point that maybe I'm not I don't want to take up too much time trying to find it, but basically he's making the point in there at some point toward the end of this section that like there aren't that many examples or there aren't that many very honored examples of practitioners kind of from all walks of life,
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I couldn't help but immediately think of like the 84 Mahasiddhas in our tradition, like the stories about them, which to me, one of the whole practical points for us to take from their stories was that basically there was someone in every walk of life who was effectively practicing. Um, so I kind of felt like, at least in that case, there are definitely examples. I mean, those are some of our most revered historical figures. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, I think one of the things that I haven't gotten much of before this book was some insight into how canon develops. How,
mm,
like, I think one thing that's different about Buddhism from maybe like Judeo-Christian religions, or maybe this isn't different, but my sense is that like the canon was sort of frozen at some point in time, like the
mm,
Bible, and it's not that there aren't still teachers and stuff, but we're not really making new canon. But at the same time, like in our Tibetan tradition, like a lot of the things, the texts we chant and practices we do can be traced back to like only several hundred years ago. And even
mm-hmm.
3-year retreat is not that old, so there's a lot of, I mean, 3-year retreat is didn't Kala Rinpoche, the previous Kala Rinpoche, start that? I mean, that's like less than 100 years ago, at least in the West. He started it in the West.
Right, right. Yeah.
But I think the idea
Yeah,
of a
I think
3-year
you might be
retreat
right.
is not even
Yeah.
that old. And so I think,
I think you're right.
yeah, so my point is like, I think that, it's interesting to get these insights into how factors that could be affecting what we take as canon or what we take as what the teaching is.
Mm,
And in particular, this idea, like I had heard about the story of how the Buddha allowed women to become monastics, and he mentions it in here where it's like he didn't really want to do it, but Ananda, pushed him, and he was like, all right, I'll do it. But the female monastics are going to have to do all these extra rules. They're going to have to be extra careful. And we want everyone to know that them being monastics is like a disease on the Dharma, and it's going to shorten the life of the Dharma. I mean, it's like, it sounds a whole lot like today's misogyny. It sounds like kind of like exactly the same things that are used today to prevent equality, and I
yeah.
like the fact that he points out that could very well have been something that was added later by
Yeah.
just practitioners of that had the power to make that sort of a change or that sort of historical
Yeah.
revision. It doesn't sound to me like something that the Buddha that I think of would say, like when else is he like, all right, but you're a scourge to all good things, like that just doesn't sound right,
Yeah.
But I love his call for restoration of equality between lay and monastics, because I mean, he references a number of lay teachers who have been super effective in the last 100 years. And I think about teachers that I have come into contact with, and many of them are lay practitioners. And I relate with them more because honestly, the people who are monastics are living a lifestyle that's nothing like mine, even beginning with the simple fact of like having to earn a living, like that's for most of us kind of a prime dynamic in our experience, is having to think about where our food and our shelter is coming from on a regular basis. And I think get some, as lay lamas, we get some of that deference, or some of that we may benefit from patrons. I definitely do, which is I wouldn't be able to do what I do without that. But I think that's a new dynamic that's happening, and probably more out of necessity than teachers saying take care of your lay teachers. I think it's more just like there are less monastic teachers making contact with Westerners, and so they kind of have to do that. And I think that's a really important thing, because the monastic model may well be from a different time, and it doesn't mean there's no benefit in it, and it's not an incredible practice. I mean, we did it for 3.5 years. I mean, I look at that time period as like being a monk for 3 years. If I'm going to say in a quick sentence to somebody what I did in 3-year retreat, it's like, I was a Buddhist monastic for 3.5 years, but like, it's not daily life that we're familiar with. And so I always hear better metaphors, better, I can't say, with the exception of Kamkarta Rinpoche, which is, the Buddha I met in this world. With the exception of him, like in most cases, like it's the lay teachers that really impact my life. And that sort of treating lay teachers as lesser than the monastics. Oh, and one last point on that is, I'll say, I remember thinking again and again in the 3-year retreat, like people would be like, oh, it must be hard. I would get letters, hope you're doing okay. Like, we really appreciate all the work you're doing in there. And once, obviously it was hard, but like at the same time, like it's harder to be out here and do this. Like this is much harder to be out in the real world and practice. Like that's a whole different kind of practice. And it actually, I think, connects you much more with all the embodied stuff we're talking about. Like if you want to see appearance as emptiness, then I think for me, there's more value in connecting with just everyday appearances rather than like putting myself in a setting that is somehow representative of ultimate truth. Like that is like almost like a middle layer that doesn't need to be there, when I could just go to the laundromat, or wait in line at the bank. Like that to me is the highest practice I can do now, in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I mean, I would tend to agree overall. The only thing I would maybe add from my experience is that I don't know if I would be in that place if I hadn't had that time of kind of like maybe cultivating some kind of stability. But I don't necessarily think it has to be that extreme or anything. I mean, the stability could potentially come from, some kind of a disciplined practice in the morning, I mean, but yeah, I kind of feel like the whole thing about monastic or lay teachers, the real issue there, I feel like, kind of goes back to maybe the point that you brought up earlier about just the traditional, like, Asian religious views. Like, you know what I mean? They maybe have a kind of deference and respect for the monastics that isn't just like quite so embedded in my brain. Like for me, I didn't really ever remember caring too much whether someone was a monk or a nun or a layperson. It was about the quality of that individual and the confidence that I had in what they were saying, and the confidence that I had maybe in their practice, or you know what I mean, like the message rather than what they looked like. And I kind of feel like uh, too much preoccupation with this kind of thing is just like missing the point. I'm not saying that anything bad about what he's writing, but just like uh, it's an issue, but at the same time, we should keep our focus on what matters, you know, which is like some essential teaching, or, you know, the communication of Dharma, I guess, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. And to that point, just one last thing I would say about this section is um, I like where he points out the potential stagnation. I think he says particularly of Asian styles of Buddhism. And he says their initial creativity and imagination have long dissipated, and their practitioners seem primarily intent on preserving time-honored doctrines and practices by endlessly repeating past teachings and instructions. And I could say that that resonated for me. Not just because I've definitely seen a lot of repeated teachings and instructions, and granted, repetition is key to this path and necessary. But I also know in particular how I know I felt this way. I think we both kind of felt this way in the beginning, is when you start to actually talk about this stuff or take a teaching role in this stuff, like there's a lot of fear about saying anything that your teacher didn't say, you know, or that you can't,
Right.
there isn't like a quote, you know, like, and it took me a while to recognize like that my context matters, you know, and like there are new teachings to be given that relate to this stuff. And there are fresh ways of doing things. And I think that I would agree with him that there is in many cases a prevailing wind of tradition, and not enough sail of innovation, you know?
Yeah.
All right. What do you think? Part 6?
Um, yeah, that sounds good to me. I don't think I have anything else from part 5.
Well, part 6, we get into talking about religious and secular. And I think he kind of outlines religious as two forms of being religious. One being concerning ourselves with ultimate concerns about birth and death and suffering and these sort of heady, everyday, not everyday, but these like inherent experiences of being human. And the other form of religion he talks about is formal practices, undertaking rituals. And he points out that it's entirely possible to do one without the other. You know, one may do all kinds of rituals, Buddhist rituals, but not really be connecting with impermanence at all, in any kind of visceral, red hot ball kind of way. Similarly, one could really be connected with the religion of ultimate situations of life and death, but not engage in any particular organized ritual. And yeah, that's
Yeah.
it definitely makes sense.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of like looking at my notes, and there's not necessarily as much insight there as I thought. But
That's right.
based on what you're saying, I mean, I did think that was a really apt point that he made, just drawing the distinction between uh, the different dimensions of what it meant to be religious. And I mean, I suppose the realistic approach for me anyway is to kind of try to have some emphasis on both of those. At this point, maybe my aim is to dig more into the concern with like ultimate truth rather than the process ritual. Um, but I mean, I think it's important to bring them both together and ultimately maybe like two sides of the same coin, like ideally, I mean, the ritual aspect of our practice is sort of meant to help us uh, get into the deeper meaning. Um, so uh, it makes me think of I think the root Latin word of religion is like religio, something to that effect,
Uh-huh.
and it means literally to reconnect. I think, um, which I think I actually remember we talked about this in a previous episode when we were talking about such matters, but that to me kind of gets at the real like deeper existential aspect of it, right? Like it's kind of to reconnect to um like our essence or something, like some deeper quality of our being, divine nature, whatever you want to say, like, but to reconnect with source somehow, I think is kind of the essential definition of religion. Um,
And it, and now he also points out, he goes into the like background of religion. He also goes into secular, and it struck me too in terms of understanding
mm,
the development of these things over time that um, one of those language uh, dynamics we need to be aware of is that he points out that the secular and religious have no equivalence in the classical Buddhist languages. There's no equivalent words for religious or secular, and
oh, right. Mm-hmm.
that's one of those things where we use these words. I mean, he also talks about it in terms of is and is not. Like these are like the ways our language work, and that way that means that also impacts the way we think. And I think being aware of religious and secular, and even the chance that there's a way of existing for whole lifetimes for maybe millennia without even a concept of religious and secular is something we should be aware of. Because it is. I've definitely bumped into it as an ordained person who also teaches secular mindfulness. And it's only
Mm-hmm.
recently too that I've even learned how much secular is really like often, and I can't say much about this because it's not a field that I have much study in, but from what I've learned, like secular it really kind of arose as a some sort of opposite to like Protestant Christianity, and like it's
Mm,
kind of they're interdependent, like and so it's not even really necessarily an accurate thing to say like, Buddhist religion versus like secular meditation, because so much of the practice of Buddhism is like a very grounded wellness practice that anyone can do, and so it's not like it's not
mm-hmm.
clear cut that like this is a secular thing and this is a religious thing, and there was some point where we in our culture decided that we would create these mental boxes to put stuff in, and stuff doesn't always fit, in one or the other, and sometimes one spills a little bit into the other, and maybe we need to start to think a little bit about what those words are even for, or why are we using them? Are we using them because it helps us be happier, or are we using them because it helps us feel
Mm,
like we have some more certainty or control? Are we using them? out of like judgment of others, you know. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
that I have answers for
Mm-hmm.
those questions, but I think they're things we should be thinking about.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. Um, yeah, uh, interesting stuff. I don't know that I have a whole lot more to add on that section, actually. Um,
That's cool. Yeah, the other couple notes I have are like, I think we've mentioned this before, but Buddhism itself is a term that was coined by Western scholars like within the last 200 years. So like
yeah,
there's no equivalent for that word in these classical Buddhist languages either. So even just thinking of this as Buddhism, like that's a convenient way, just put an ism on it, then you've got like then it sounds like a religion. And and so
yeah,
and to one of your earlier points too, I also want to reiterate the idea that Dharma is a remedy to habits that cause suffering. And sometimes, a lot of times that remedy is a ritual or doing a certain pre-prescribed religious thing, is remedy. But I've found that I
mm-hmm.
think a lot of times we have to remind ourselves that in a given moment, we may not need a remedy at that point. You take a remedy
Right.
until you don't need it anymore, and we'll get more into this when he starts to talk about the four tasks, as he calls them, the Four Noble Truths. But
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you're just present. You're just present.
Mm-hmm.
There's no thing you need to do to be more awake
Right,
in
right.
that moment. And I think a lot of times we get hung up on like needing to do the thing that we were trained in the certain way, and that becomes an impediment and attachment of its own.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a great point. Um, yeah. And I mean, another thing that jumps out to me, I just thought of it because you're, talking about like the creation of the word Buddhism, basically. But basically, right under that, he starts to get into just how, in the historical context of the Buddha's original teaching, uh, I guess I had never thought about this really before, but there's just certain aspects of uh, traditional Indian metaphysical views and whatnot that I guess the Buddha. I feel like the way that he presents it in here is that the Buddha just didn't really maybe see the point of bothering with like discarding all that. He kind of just took some of that for granted and left the cultural context intact in some of the teachings. And I guess I actually had never really thought about that, like certain cultural views having been sort of wed to the Dharma from the beginning, you know? I mean, we know that that's happened as time has gone on, but um, yeah. So that was kind of interesting. I guess a lot of that is probably like Hindu philosophy, which I don't really know all that much about, but it's just a kind of an interesting and honestly like uh, that's probably one of the most kind of bold and compelling threads in here so far is to like question the historical context to that extent. I never would have really thought about that.
Yeah, I
Pretty.
agree. Yeah, and I think he talks about like the different voices. This is taking us into part 7 too. Like I think he's talking about how there's the like poetic voices, so voices in the early text, poetic voices, dramatic voices, skeptical voices, pragmatic voices, dogmatic voices, mythic voices. But it really struck me how he said like it's the skeptical and the pragmatic voices that kind of really stand out to him. And he says
Mm-hmm.
that I think he describes like bracketing off things that could very well have been of the time. Like all the religions around at that time believed in karma. It was just an assumption.
Right.
Rebirth, like that was just built in. So like we have to be a little skeptical of like whether the Buddha said that or that was just kind of part of the basic
Right.
worldview at that time. And I like the idea that when I think he said like when you see something that potentially conflicts with other things or like maybe not entirely reconcilable with the other text around it, like he weights that as more likely to be the actual words of the Buddha, because I mean you can add things
Uh-huh.
and tweak things to kind of support the broader narrative if you're putting together a text, you know. And
Hmm.
I'm sure everyone has the best intentions. I think he even says like well-intentioned later editors, you know, like I'm sure everybody has the best
Right.
intentions, but I doubt people were cutting things the Buddha said. And I think it's quite likely that people were adding rather than cutting. And that means that those pieces that don't quite seem to fit are more likely going to be things that he actually said. And
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
which is like we were saying, it's like this illumination for me. It was like illuminating how these texts came to be and how the canon started to form. You know, obviously like he's just one person with some opinions, but like these are things I never really thought about before, like you said about, you
Yeah.
know, cultural context of the Buddha's teaching.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, yeah. I did sort of find this one passage that I made a note about finally, which we may have kind of moved on from it already, but I guess I'll just mention it for the heck of it.
Yeah.
Uh, it's on page 17, and it's this part where it's the kind of toward the end of the second paragraph on there where he's talking about how, like, instead of imagining a dharma that erects even firmer barriers around the alienated self, let us imagine one that works toward a reenchantment of the world. Doing so will require the cultivation of a sensibility to what might be called the quote everyday sublime, which he goes on to say that he's going to talk about more. But you know, I thought that was I keep making all these I'm like talking from the perspective of, wait a minute, that stuff's already all in the Dharma, you know? So to, to continue on that theme, I would just say that, like, again, I do think that those are kind of like the hallmark views of Vajrayana Buddhism. It may
Mm-hmm.
not always be what's presented up front, but like that is kind of the point of it all, as far as I understood. Um, you know, that's where it's all headed. Um, so, and then that kind of makes me think a little bit like, you know, just the like in re-enchantment of the world is like practically, I would say, the same thing as sacred outlook. You know,
Yeah.
at least related territory, and but it makes me kind of think a little bit like. Uh, I wonder if there might not be some reality to the fact that the most skillful presentation of these teachings is not necessarily to tell people that sort of stuff right up front, but like I'm thinking sort of the way in which we were taught, um, and probably like so many other teachers present it, is to kind of not give you the juicy bits right away. They're going to tell you basically the straight talk, you know, and the practices that you need to do to eventually like taste a little bit of the juicy bits, you know. I mean, not to say like one is better than the other, like but I do think that there could be some logic in the approach of like this sort of insight is what you yourself need to figure out. It's not necessarily what your teacher tells you first thing, you know.
Yeah,
uh,
yeah, yeah. I definitely agree. Well, and I don't have too much more. I would just say I want to include, because I think this frames up what's coming. He talks about kind of distilling out what he calls the 4 P's, and these are the 4 central ideas that do not have direct precedence in Indian tradition. So thinking in terms of bracketing off the cultural, what could be just the cultural milieu. Is that the right use of that word?
yeah, yeah.
At the time. And those 4 P's are the principle of conditionality, the practice of the fourfold task, the perspective of mindful awareness, and the power of self-reliance. And he says an understanding of conditionality as the context. He says that he sees the primary vision of the Buddha to be an understanding of conditionality as the context for a fourfold task. And this is a preview of what's coming. He describes the fourfold task, which we have described before as the Four Noble Truths, and that's probably what most people know this as. He calls it the fourfold task. And he describes it as to comprehend suffering, to let go of the arising of reactivity, to behold the ceasing of reactivity, and to cultivate an eightfold path that is grounded in the perspective of, and then we get to the 3rd P, which is mindful awareness, and leads one to become the 4th P, self-reliant in the practice of the Dharma. So the principle of conditionality, the practice of the fourfold task, the perspective of mindful awareness, and the power of self-reliance in the practice of the Dharma. I like it.
Yeah, absolutely. I sort of remember one time during a 10-day teaching, way back at Kemper Rinpoche's 10-day teachings. I remember at one of those 10-day teachings, reading this jogged my memory that somebody actually asked a question about this book's formulation of the Four Noble Truths. Which is interesting because I think at that time this would have been a new book, because that was 20. This is publication dates 2015, and that would have been right at the time that I was at KTD recording the teachings and stuff. Like, so it was probably a new book then, and somebody asked the question about that formulation of the Four Noble Truths. And I remember, I'm not even sure if Lamy Eshe, the translator Lamy Eshe, I'm not even sure if he ended up asking Rinpoche the question, because Lamy Eshe himself felt so strongly about some inaccuracy in this that he just was answering it himself. But I'm looking at it now, and so okay, so the roughly equivalent thing to the first noble truth here, I guess, would be to comprehend suffering, right?
And I think we usually say to understand suffering.
Right. So the point of the issue in this case that I'm remembering was the word reactivity. So the second one here is to let go of the arising of reactivity. So I guess the arising of reactivity would be the cause of suffering. That seems to be what he's saying.
Well, we'll definitely go a lot deeper, I think, in the next chapter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So I would say I wouldn't want to speculate too much, because we'll go into a whole chapter about this too.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. We'll wait on it. But anyway, so maybe we'll bring this back up. But my conclusion about that, I guess, for now is just that this doesn't quite match up to what I remember from that conversation. The inaccuracies that were observed back then don't quite seem to hold up here, but at the same time I'm a little confused about this formulation, but I guess we'll get to it.
Good. I like that though. Little provocative. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and honestly, like maybe that's a good way to kind of wrap up the dialogue too, is like, I think it's interesting that, like he starts out by saying that some people may see what he says in this book to be heretical, and he said, even I feel a little uncomfortable when I see the things that I've said. And I think, I guess I kind of like that. I don't doubt that he's fully dedicated to cultivating the path in his life. And I love the fact that he is willing to kind of say, with his experience in translating and learning, that he's willing to kind of get into new formulations of things and willing to, with devotion and I think good motivations, hopefully, to explore things in a new way that are kind of provocative, even if we leave feeling like maybe we don't agree with the way he formulated it. Right. That alone is a cause for thinking and questioning and examining and doubt, the kind of doubt that could bring about, no doubt, no awakening, little doubt, little awakening, great doubt, great awakening. So I think that willingness on his part to take that kind of a leap, and we know, because we talked about it earlier, it still makes, I know it makes me a little nervous even just talking about the Dharma still. And so I'm glad that he had the courage to put out there what he thinks, even if it isn't for everybody,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, interesting stuff. I don't think I have anything else specifically.
All right. Well, we'll pick up next time with chapter 2. I think chapter 2 is where we get into the four thoughts. We'll have to see, but I'm pretty sure that's where it comes. So, yeah.
Cool.
All right. Well, any final thoughts? Put in plug for Humid Subtropic, wherever you get your music.
Right. Listen to Humid Subtropic. We got a gig tomorrow night at Martin's again, same place.
Awesome. Yeah.
So everybody come on down to Jackson. And if anyone travels from out of town to come see us play, I promise you a place to stay.
Oh, that's so cool. Nice. Well, yeah, and I would say, check out my nonprofit, Mindfulness for Life. We've been doing programming with Boys and Girls Club. I never envisioned teaching kids mindfulness, but it is super fun. I love it, and so we work with them, and we're just trying to realize this mission of expanding access to trauma-informed mindfulness and meditation training for free in underserved communities.
Wow.
Really trying to bring research-backed practices that help people into the places where they are not already. So I'm happy to be part of Buddhist communities and meditation communities, but we are trying to take this beyond those communities and help people who need it. So if you would consider checking out our website, mindfulness-for-life.org, and make a donation if you can, or avail yourself of one-on-one coaching or corporate consulting. So those are all supportive of our charitable mission. So, all right.
Awesome.
Well, Mitchell, hang out. Everybody else, I'll see you. We'll see you next week or sometime soon. Later.